without further ado, Miss Heidi Lovie. Dr. Lovie, please.
Yeah, it's so good to see so many faces, so many familiar faces. So when Kelly and I were talking about this lecture series, it was like we were kind of like brainstorming a little bit about what needs to be presented to the clinic and what you guys like as students and clinicians need that I would be able to present. And I wanted to talk about Hashimoto's because it's actually what brought me into the field. So I was diagnosed at 18 with autoimmune and formally diagnosed at about 26, 27 with Hashimoto's. And I was not happy with the standard of care that I was getting. So, so it was really what sparked the interest in Chinese medicine because it's what turned my own thyroid disease around. And so since then, I've worked with a couple thousand patients, Hashi patients. I would never ever say that I specialized. I would just say that I have a special interest in it. And I think what's important about Hashi's is how we start reframing the conversation around it. Because we have so much to offer from a Chinese medicine standpoint. There's actually a lot of magic that happens in the treatment room. And so, but I wanted to do like a couple of things with you guys today. So the top 4 things that I think you can expect today is clearly we're talking about thyroid. But we're going to do a quick review of Thyroid 101 because I want to make sure that you guys are empowered and have the basics around this so that we can have a kind of like a masterclass level discussion around Hashi's. So we need to make sure that we're all on the same page with that. We're going to talk about what is Hashimoto's, who is affected by Hashi's. I'm going to talk specifically about blood work through the lens of Chinese medicine. You may or may not have had this in the past, but I have to say within the past like 4 to 5 years, there's more resources being published around this. So we're going to specifically look at Hashi's blood work, and then I'm going to give you some treatment room ideas that you can kind of keep in your back pocket. And then I want to give you guys 8 ways to keep your patients on the Healing Hashi bandwagon. What are things that you can do to help manage patients' experience through this and kind of help them move the marker forward? All right, so Hashi's 101. The most common thyroid disorder in the United States. So there are actually 14 million people in the US diagnosed with this. So that's really 1 to 1.5 out of 1,000 with a formal diagnosis. That being said, because of the way that blood work is recorded and blood work is done, it's kind of a quiet epidemic. There are some thoughts in autoimmune circles that this number could even be double because people are sitting subclinical or they've just never been formally diagnosed. It occurs almost 15 times more frequently in women than men. And it's most often observed in women between 30 and 60 years of age. However, we have to start breaking some of those stereotypes. We're starting to see the age creep down quite a bit. So I've actually had 3 cases of pediatric Hashimoto's in children under the age of 5. So now the question is like, why is this showing up? That's something that we could debate all day. It's an autoimmune disorder. And so we have to be very clear about this is yes, we're talking about thyroid, but there's a difference between an immune disorder and an endocrine disorder. And we're going to get into the basics of this, but it's important to remember that the thyroid piece of this is secondary to the immune system. So the thyroid is getting beat up, but it's the immune system that's doing the attack. So what we're talking about is a hyperactive immune system, and that's what most often gets lost in this conversation. So often we think thyroid, 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 and whenever there's an endocrine issue, the doctor that you're going to go see generally is going to be an endocrinologist. However, when we're talking about an immune system issue and how to repair the thyroid from a Chinese medicine standpoint, and like the way that we're coming into this, we have to focus on the immune first. And the thing about Hashi's is it likes to travel in packs. So some autoimmunes tend to come in clusters. And that's not to say that if you have Hashi's, you're going to develop something else. The CDC recognizes over 100 different independent autoimmune diseases. And out of these, now some of these are pretty rare. Some of these autoimmune diseases that they recognize have identified populations of under 2,000 people. So, but like in the bigger ones, the one constant between like all autoimmunes is going to be inflammation. So why that inflammation chooses to show like in the thyroid in this person, or MS in this person, lupus in this person, Graves in this person. Again, that's a little bit beyond the scope of this conversation. But once we see Hashi's, we want to start looking for other things as well, because it's the inflammation that's going to go start to attack different tissues in the body. Now, the hypothyroid symptoms, if you look at this list, right, I want you to always look at these lists through the scope of Chinese medicine and through the scope of pattern differentiation. Just pretend that like hypothyroid didn't like sit on the slide. So as we're looking at this, we see things like muscle aches, constipation, weight gain, dry hair, brittle nails, mental disorders. So what we're starting to see is gross blood deficiency. We're starting to see issues with yang deficiency, such as cold intolerance. We're starting to see things like forgetfulness, right? Depression. So now, like we're starting to see it could be not just like yang deficiency, but there could be phlegm encumbering. We're starting to see like heart involvement with this as well. So it's important to remember that yes, thyroid, but from a Chinese medicine standpoint, this is a multi-system dysfunction. And so, you know, one of the ways, you know, when I learned about Hashi's in school as a student, what was kind of hammered into us was kidney yang deficiency, kidney yang deficiency, kidney yang deficiency. And yes, in part. However, there's other things involved, and we're going to look at other symptoms. And you have to remember also that Hashi's comes in all shapes and sizes. So there's this stereotype, right, that like a Hashi's or a thyroid presentation, a hypothyroid presentation, it's going to be a big body, puffy, edema. Maybe, maybe not. And this is another reason that it tends to go underdiagnosed, is because if somebody's presenting with fatigue, lethargy, but they're skinny, they're thin, the first place that MDs go is not necessarily going to be towards thyroid testing. So right now, the current allopathic treatments for this is, you've guessed it, medication. So, and remember, from a Western standpoint, there generally is two interventions that they have at their hands. They have either surgical, right, mechanical, or chemical, RX. So the intervention for thyroid, regardless of whether it's just simple hypothyroidism, meaning the immune system's not attacking the thyroid, that's thyroid primary. That the thyroid is just starting to slow down. What they're going to do is they're going to add hormones. There's a type of hormone replacement therapy, and that includes synthetic T4, and it includes synthetic T3, or desiccated thyroid. And so these are drugs that you've seen and you've known. They show up on charts all the time. You know, you for sure know someone who's taking them, right? So synthetic T4 includes things like levothyroxine, synthroid, levothyroid, unithroid, tyrosine. These are all, this is a class of drugs. Now, T4, and we're gonna get into the kind of chemical signatures of these guys in a second. T4 converts into T3, which is the more active form of the thyroid hormone. And so there's synthetic T3 as well, which is The big two are cytomel or triostat. Desiccated thyroid, right? So this is usually coming from porcine or lamb. And so the three big ones on the market are Armour thyroid, Nature thyroid, and Westhroid. Now, what's important to know, again, from an allopathic standpoint, the desiccated thyroid kind of started to fall out of favor in the late 80s, early 90s, because as levothyroxine and synthroid hit the scene, what happened is because it's synthetic, it's controlled. So meaning in T4, if the dose is say like 125 milligrams, every single pill is going to be 125 milligrams. In desiccated thyroid, what happens is because it's an animal product, I consider desiccated thyroid to be an herb, really, right? It's a Western manufactured herb, because remember that we use minerals, plants, and animals. So this is animal product, but it's not as standardized necessarily as a synthetic. So if you're taking a desiccated thyroid and maybe one pill is 125, the next might be 130, the next might be like 120. So that's often the argument that's used against using desiccated thyroid, because like a lot of MDs don't feel like it's as consistent as it needs to be. But neither is your thyroid. Your thyroid is seasonal. It's an organ. And the thing is, like, your thyroid doesn't like pump out like 125, 125, 125. It doesn't do that. Your thyroid's reacting to the environment around you. And so the thyroid's going to go up and the thyroid's going to go down. And that's why we need to test pretty regularly. So let's look at thyroid hormones 101 before we jump into Hashi's, because I really want to make sure that you guys have your arms around this. So the objective testing that's done, there's standard thyroid tests, and then there's an expanded thyroid test. So the standard thyroid test includes TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. It includes T4, and it includes T3. And we're going to look at each of these independently. But an expanded thyroid test, where we can actually get more information and we can start to understand the flavor almost of what's happening with the thyroid and why it's really banging someone up. An expanded test is going to include free T4, free T3, reverse T3. Now, I'm not going to get into those three too much, because I really want to talk about TPOs, which is thyroid perioxidase antibodies. And we're going to talk about thyroglobulin antibodies as well. But in an expanded test, we can actually start to see like how much thyroid is being pumped out by the gland itself and how much is available for metabolism. All right, so let's look at TSH first. So the basics of TSH is, you guys who've had Dr. Olga, I still think she has the absolute best description on the street of this, of how the endocrine system works. So in this model, the way that Olga teaches it, and it's just so brilliant, I think, you got to think of the pituitary gland as like the CEO of the company, right? So the CEO, like Jamie Dimon or like any of those guys on Wall Street, their job is to say, well, who are we in the world as a company? Where are we going? Where are we going in 5 years? Like, what's the master plan? So the pituitary is really more about like the meta view of how the organism is moving through the world. And then all like the middle management is going to be like thyroid, thymus, pancreas, adrenals, and then gonads, right? And depending whether that's going to be like ovaries or testicles. So it's the pituitary's job to monitor and harmonize, really. So TSH is produced in the anterior pituitary, and it stimulates the thyroid gland. So anytime you see SH in any sort of blood test, stimulating hormone, that stimulating hormone, think about it as the volume that the pituitary is speaking to middle management. How loud is it having to talk to another gland in order to get it to work? So the higher the number of TSH, same thing with FSH, right? Follicular stimulating hormone. the higher the number of SH, that's the louder that the pituitary is having to speak to get the thyroid to actually work. So that means that low level, there's an inverse relationship to this. So low levels of thyroid generally suggest that there's high levels of thyroid hormone. So because the thyroid is pumping it out, so the pituitary is not having to stimulate it. And so high levels of TSH, of stimulating hormone, are going to indicate that there are low levels of thyroid hormones. So the results of this is something that's logically inferred, as it were. But what's important, the purpose of this test is an overall indication of thyroid function. So TSH as a test will sometimes show up in CBCs, right? It's an easy test. The essays for it, the testing standards really kind of came to fruition in the 80s and 90s. And it's a pretty sophisticated test. However, what we need to look for is the absence of disease versus the ideal. So when you get those lab reports, and the lab reports, it has the range to them. Now, the range on these things is going to be 0.3 to 5.5 for TSH. But the ideal, where you actually want the TSH to be sitting, is 0.5 to 2.0. Okay, so why is this, why do we even care about this? Well, we care about, again, it's the volume at which the pituitary is having to speak to the other glands. So if we tighten up the reference range, 0.5 to 2.0 is where most people feel pretty good. What can happen is, like, let's say that the TSH shows up as 3.5, 4.2, 4.5, something like that. And the patient is like, you know what, like, my hair is falling out. I'm so fatigued. I can't wake up in the morning. Like, I'm gaining weight. I'm just like depressed. Like, I don't know what's going on. And the doctor will say, like, well, your TSH is 5.5, 4.5. You're fine. Have some Wellbutrin. Have some Xanax. Like, you need to calm down a little bit. Right? But when we actually start to tighten up that reference range and realize, like, oh, the pituitary is actually struggling, but we haven't tested anything else. So what happens with TSH is a lot of the times these allopathic doctors are not going to look for further testing until it falls outside of range. And so that means that somebody could be subclinical for years because they've fallen within the testing range. However, the issue with this is it tests the pituitary. This is not the actual thyroid itself. So again, the results of this test are something that we're inferring. So from a Chinese medicine standpoint, right, because that's what we are, we're Chinese medicine practitioners at heart. So from a Chinese medicine standpoint, the way that, like, I'd like you to think about TSH is think of it as a hot hormone. It's hot in nature and its job is to stimulate. So it has this very yang function. So again, low levels of TSH indicate high thyroid hormones. And high levels of TSH are going to indicate low thyroid hormones. So what that means is that low levels of TSH indicate the pituitary is trying to turn down the thermostat. Low levels of TSH is that hot hormone. There's less yang to the system. And so when we look for this, right, because we're going to start to see that thyroid in itself is kind of warm. So when there's low levels of TSH, we're going to look for things like overconsumption of qi and yang, wasting of fluids, empty heat. You're going to look for heart fire diagnostic markers. And in conventional medicine, the example of this would be Graves' disease, right? The example of this is an autoimmune disorder where the thyroid is overreacting. Now in Hashi's, right, high TSH is often seen in Hashi's because the pituitary is trying to stimulate the thyroid hormone. because the gland itself is starting to cool down. So what we start looking for is if we see high TSH in the blood work, we're going to look for examples of spleen yang deficiency, heart yang deficiency, kidney yang deficiency. We're going to look for blood deficiency. So we're going to use the blood work to simply start to point us towards Chinese medicine diagnosis and confirmation or denial of things that we might already be seeing in our usual intake. Qi deficiency. Okay, let's talk about T4. So T4, the basics of T4, right, it's called thyroxine, and it's the main form of thyroid hormone produced by the thyroid gland. So I know you guys, like, we run from chemistry like hell, right? Like, I know, like, I do like chemistry, just like it makes my brain twist a little bit. But in this case, chemistry is a little bit important. So thyroxine is formed when 4 iodine molecules hook up with tyrosine and are married in the protein thyroglobulin. Okay, what the hell does this even mean? So what this means is that these are the building blocks of thyroid hormone, is tyrosine, iodine, and thyroglobulin. We need these 3 things to make the hormone. They're precursors for the hormone. So tyrosine is a food-based amino acid. Iodine is a food-based essential mineral. So these are not things that the body is producing itself, but these are things that have to be brought in with Gucci. And then thyroglobulin, which is a protein that's produced by the thyroid. So in these building blocks, T4 is actually fairly inert and it must be activated. So you need to think of T4 as stored potential energy. Or the way that I explain this to patients all the time, the way that I explain it is like, okay, you wake up in the morning and you do your food prep and you're going out for the day, because here in New York, that's what we do. We look a little bit homeless sometimes because, like, we leave our house and we're not coming back home till the end of the day. So we have to have everything with us. So you leave the house in the morning and you have your snacky snacks so you don't get hungry later. And you have like your bag of Kind bars. So think of these Kind bars as your T4, right? They're potential, they're there when you need them. Okay, so 1 o'clock happens, I'm kind of hungry, I need a snacky snack. You pull out your T4. Well, something's got to happen to that before you're able to use it. You actually have to convert it and open it. And that opening is opening it to T3. What's inside there is T3. And now we're able to use it. So T4 is really more potential. And to be fully used, the body has to convert it to T3. So the absence of disease versus the ideal in our blood tests, right? Pretty big range. So 11 to 20 is the absence of disease. And again, these are just measurements, and it depends if it's like from Quest or LabCorp or whoever it's coming from. So we can see there's the absence of disease, but of course, like if we tighten it up, like the ideal is really like a little bit smaller than that. And so we're looking at the gland's actual ability to create these things. Now, Chinese medicine standpoint, right? Let's come back to this. So because T4 is the storage form of thyroid, T4 is more of a yin substance than the active T3. It is a precursor to a very yang hormone in nature. So, and then to take this like a step further, right? This is why this isn't like Chinese medicine gets like just sexy and fun. But to take this a step further, iodine is a mineral that's actually essential for intellectual development. And iodine itself can be correlated with nourishing the intellect via the supporting function of the spleen, because we have to take that in through Gucci. Tyrosine, we're talking about these building blocks again. So tyrosine is a precursor to adrenaline and dopamine, which are transmitters related to the heart, and that's the respect to experience of joy and reward, dopamine. So it stimulates the heart yang with adrenaline. So what we're really looking at is when iodine and tyrosine, I'm coming back to these building blocks, When iodine and tyrosine are married in the protein thyroglobulin, they create this yin substance, this T4 hormone that has an affinity for both the heart and the spleen. So another reason that I'm kind of bringing this up is I want to start to break the stereotype that thyroid is only kidney yang. It's just simply not clinically effectual to only look at it as kidney yang. We need to be looking at the heart and the spleen. You know, T4 has more iodine and less tyrosine. So T4 is therefore a less potent yang effect in the body. It actually has a longer half-life than T3, more moistening qualities, and it's actually Shen anchoring. So if T4 is deficient, what we're going to start to look for is heart blood deficiency. We're going to start to look for heart yin deficiency. We're going to look for unsettled Shen. And you see this so commonly, and not just like Hashis, but just regular thyroid patients as well. So if there's no yin to anchor the yang, the next thing that we look for in this scenario is T3 issues. So we start looking for yang. We're going to go hunt and peck for it. Okay, so T3. So the basics of T3 is this triiodothyronine. And it's produced a little bit in the thyroid, but it's actually mostly made through that conversion of T4, like opening up the snacky snacks, converting from T4 to T3. So T3 is the active form of thyroid, and it's the most biologically potent form of this hormone. So conversion of T4 to T3 is performed actually mostly in the liver, a little bit in the gut, but the liver as well. And that alchemical transformation requires glucose, selenium, zinc, and progesterone. So these are kind of the magical ingredients of getting that to open. But T3 specifically helps with also, now again, watch this from a Chinese medicine standpoint, muscle control, brain function development, heart and digestive functions, and it plays a role in metabolic rate. And it helps with the maintenance of bone health. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing kidney, we're seeing spleen, we're seeing heart, and we're seeing yang. The conversion of T4 to T3, though, it's almost like 100% dependent on liver qi. We need the liver to actually move to open that up. And so factors that inhibit that conversion are all factors that are going to bang up a liver. You know, things like alcohol, chemo, cigarettes, stress, surgery, medications, nutrient depletions, heavy metals, growth hormone deficiency, fasting. Like there are so many things, and these are all things that we kind of watch for in the population. So if we have somebody that's presenting as deficient or fatigued, like that's another place that we can often start is the liver. All right. So let's keep going with this. If T3 is deficient, what we're going to start looking for is heart qi deficiency, spleen qi deficiency, heart yang deficiency. We're going to look for spleen yang deficiency, kidney yang deficiency. So what we're really looking for, again, is we're looking for deficiencies in this case. Okay, so let's round up what we've learned so far, just so I can consolidate some of this before we move on. So some of the key points that I hope you've gotten so far is that TSH is a hot hormone, and the levels indicate that the body is trying to activate qi and yang if the TSH is elevated. It's trying to turn something on. T4, yin-like hormone, the body creates using an amino, a mineral, and a protein. And if T4 is deficient, look for yin and blood deficiency. T3 is yang-like, that's converted from T4. And if T3 is deficient, we're going to look for qi and yang deficiencies. And if T3 is deficient in the blood work, but T4 is in range in that reference range, but the T3 is crashing out, you need to check for liver Qi stagnation. Yeah, and it could be, there's a couple questions here. How do you differentiate between a thyroid disorder and a liver disease? ALT, ASTs, you come back to the blood work. Just come straight back to the blood work. So someone who drinks a lot daily but has shown no sign of disease until a Hashi's diagnosis, it could be the drinking. No, because not necessarily. Not necessarily. But I'm going to have you hold that thought for a second, because we're still hanging out in hormone land. We haven't landed in Hashi's land yet. So Hashi's land, we're going to jump into that, and that might answer your question. So key points that you can think about too is add sources of zinc and selenium to the diet if you see blood deficiency. And if fatigue cycles throughout the day, glucose issues could be a contributing factor. So the spleen Qi needs to be stable to keep the liver in check. So from a practice standpoint, the place that I always start, I always start with this, is I always start with the spleen. What's going on with the spleen? Because if I start giving them herbs, or I start giving them supplements, or I start doing any of that, and they're not digesting it, the issue is you could just put it in the garbage and be none the wiser. They're just wasting their money on that. So I always start with the spleen, because I really want to make sure that anything I'm adding, that they have the ability to digest. So key points too is that thyroid has both a yin and a yang component, and that Hashi's, which we're going to look at here in a second, it's a multi-system disease out of ease that affects the spleen, the lungs, the liver, the kidneys, and the heart. So this is not a single system issue. You have to be looking at all systems. Okay, now what defines Hashi's? Well, what defines Hashi's is the presence of antibodies. So that's the difference between simple hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's. And a lot of times, patients don't always necessarily know. They just say like, oh, I'm taking Synthroid, and it's what the doctor gave me. I don't even know. Well, you need to know, because again, remember that I started this conversation off by saying this is an immune system issue where it's the thyroid that's getting beat up. And so it's the antibodies that this is where we have value add. 100% this is where we have value add. So thyroid perioxidase, from a conventional medicine standpoint, TPO is an enzyme that's required to manufacture thyroid hormones, and this enzyme is actually produced inside the thyroid gland itself. So in Hashi's, the body's immune system produces antibodies that attack thyroid perioxidase, and as the immune system tries to destroy the enzyme, what winds up happening is thyroid tissue around that enzyme gets destroyed in the process. So occasionally there are cases of elevated TPO antibodies without thyroid disease. I've seen this a handful of times. When this shows up, though, it's normally something like Sjogren's, lupus, RA, pernicious anemia. I've also seen it in celiac disease, right? So we can have TPOs that are the antibodies that are attacking other sites. And again, that's a little bit outside the scope of this, but like I do want you guys to know that it can happen, though rare. But TPO is the enzyme required for the creation of thyroid hormone, and it acts as a catalyst. So that catalyst nature serves the yang component of the reaction. So TPO antibodies are interfering with a yang aspect of the thyroid. So TPOs are elevated. What we're going to look for: yang deficiency, Qi stagnation, blood deficiency, empty cold, Shen disharmony. And we're actually going to be looking at Shao Yin imbalances where there's a kidney-heart miscommunication of some kind, right? So, and what can often happen is depending on the blood work, right? So the presence of antibodies in and of itself is a positive diagnosis for Hashimoto's. So there's two types of, there's two measuring standards for the blood work, where one measuring is over 9, the other is over 34. It just depends on the serum levels. But the presence of antibodies, let's say that the blood serum is 80 versus 800 versus 8,000. Those are three absolutely, completely, totally different scenarios. And they're going to have different effects on the body because that's the army. That's like how many troops are in the system attacking that enzyme and tearing up the thyroid. And so what's going to happen is as the thyroid gets swollen and that tissue starts to, the follicles get choked off, it's not, even if it's producing, it's not going to be able to release it into the system. And it starts to create soft scar tissue, adhesions, collagen bindings, and the thyroid itself is going to swell. So let's look at TGAB. So TGAB is the other protein that's made in the thyroid gland itself. So, and remember, like thyroglobulin, we already stated prior, this is the site where tyrosine and iodine get married to create T4. So it provides this enzymatic ability for it to function. This is the yin anchoring the yang. So in Hashi's, the body's immune system may also produce antibodies that attack thyroglobulin. So it's the protein stage for the hormone creation. So thyroglobulin has a role that's very yin in nature. Antibodies being produced against the yin aspect of the thyroid have more of a stagnation component than the TPO. So the TPOs, that's more like the yang deficiency. TGABs, it's going to be more stagnation. So we're going to look for qi stagnation, blood deficiency, Xiao-yang imbalances, kidney-heart miscommunication. So treating Hashi's is an antibody game because what can happen is you can have antibodies for TPOs, TGABs, one, the other, or both. And that's, again, where we start seeing like the flavor of Hashi's is different from patient to patient. So my experience of Hashi's is not going to be the same experience as the patient in front of me or what's getting published in blogs. It's going to be very different. Every single one of us that moves through this kind of autoimmune, we're having a different sense. Now, there are some things that are kind of universal, and we'll get to that in a second, but we start with this as an antibody game. And so it's often called autoimmune thyroiditis because the antibodies create inflammation. I'm going to come back to that inflammation piece. It's inflammation within the gland itself. Okay, so let me give you some treatment room strategies. Number one, remember, we treat people, not disease. We're in this for the people, right? And you will never see me say that, like, I'm an expert in Hashimoto's, like, blah, blah, blah. No, I am a general practitioner and I love my patients. And it just so happens that most of my patients have Hashi's. So you can kind of get lost in some of the blood work, and it can be like, well, is it AST? Is it ALT? Do we look at this? Do we look at functional medicine? It doesn't matter. You look at the person in front of you and you treat the person, and you need to treat the pattern, right? So always, always, always treat the pattern. The blood work can kind of like explain where you need to go with some of this, and it can be confirmation or denial of what you're seeing from the Chinese medicine standpoint, but treat the pattern. And then the blood work can help point you towards the pattern, but the blood work's not the end all be all, because trust your toolkit. Trust your toolkit as a Chinese medicine practitioner. You know, and remember that we actually have 8 branches to Chinese medicine, you know, and we have 5 treatment room modalities. And then we have these like, you know, and that's going to be like our acupuncture, herbs, nutrition, Tui Na, Qigong, right? Those are the main 5. But also remember, we have time-space modalities that we don't necessarily talk about, like outside these like closed Zoom rooms, because we might sound a little crazy. But the time-space modalities within our medicine are just as powerful. And that's going to be meditation, feng shui, and cosmology, because that's how you move internally, how you move locally, like what affects you internally, what affects you locally, and what affects you universally. So from the treatment room, acupuncture, acupuncture is an immune modulator. And acupuncture is highly, highly, highly anti-inflammatory. And now if you came to this talk looking for protocols for Hashis, I'm going to disappoint you. I'm going to grossly disappoint you, and I'm okay with that, because there's no ancient Chinese secret. There's no like magic protocol. You treat the pattern, and you treat the pattern regularly, the antibodies will actually come down. So sure, that's going to be like your stomach 36, your Li4, your, Li10s, like, anything on the Yang Ming, because the Yang Ming, it's rich in qi and blood. And we've seen the Yang Ming do amazing things with Wei Qi. So as long as like the acupuncture is being done regularly, right? And by regularly, I mean once a week for a little while. And then sometimes you can push them out to once every other week. And eventually, like, I try and get most of my patients on a daily herbal schedule and having them just come in once a month for wellness, really. But acupuncture as an immune modulator, like as long as you're playing within your wheelhouse, and it doesn't matter if you're doing TCM, if you're doing Master Dong, if you're doing 5 element, just be poking your people. Be poking your people, because the acupuncture is going to start to get that hyperactive immune system to calm down. And moxa, like I can't like express moxa enough, right? So a question here, if someone has lupus and hypothyroidism, is it likely she has Hashimoto's? Yeah, it's very likely. And it would be one of those things where I would recommend that they go and get tested for it specifically. Okay, now moxa. One of the things that I do with moxibustion all the time is I send patients home with moxa sticks, and I teach them how to moxa themselves. So again, stomach 36, to actually moxa the thyroid is an incredible like adjunct therapy to it. Absolutely incredible. And I've had patients who they've done rice grain moxas on themselves, where they've done rice grain like LI18, stomach 9, anywhere kind of in the area, because remember, moxa is not heat. Moxa is yang. And when the TSH goes up, right, because TSH is a hot hormone, it's going up, it's trying to stimulate the thyroid because the thyroid is cooling down. So from a treatment room strategy with Hashi's, moxa is going to be one of your best friends. I have a giant moxa box. I can't tell you how much moxa I go through each week. And like I wind up tying my hair up in the office half the time because it's like an opium den in my office, right? But what we're trying to do is we're trying to get yang back in there, because listen, like if moxa was just heat, you just use a heat lamp. But a heat lamp is not going to turn the thyroid back on. Moxa will. And so whether it's a moxa box, rice grain, anything. And moxa is one of those things where you like, if somebody's truly yang deficient, it is impossible to overdo. It's like it's really, really, really hard, like damn near impossible to overdo. So the more moxa, the better. Gua sha. Okay, so this actually is my secret weapon. And this is another reason that I teach, because there was a number of years ago, a student approached me and said, hey, I found the study written in Korea where they tested patients with Hashimoto's, they tested their TPOs before and after doing gua sha, and the TPOs started coming down. And I read the study, and this is again why we make you guys do all these research classes, right? I read the study and it was a crap study. The study was just like terrible, but the theory was good. The theory was really good. And in this study, what they did is they had people gua sha the back of their necks, and the results of the study were almost astounding. Like there were TPOs, there were antibodies that were dropping upwards of 80%. And that was only the back of the neck. Now, I will tell you, like gua sha is just like something you can do at home, and it's something that you can teach your patients. So what I want you to think about, like as another takeaway, right, is when we have antibody attacks that are attacking the thyroid and it's attacking that gland, the thyroid gland itself, it's the only gland that's front and center. So thymus, right, it sits behind the breastplate, the gonads, you know, well, ovaries, like, yes, gonads are out, testicles are out, but ovaries are up and in, the adrenals are up and in, pituitary is in, but you can actually feel the thyroid. And so what happens is when there's antibody attack, the Ren line is going to start to tighten. And when the Ren line tightens, I have almost yet to meet a Hashimoto patient that doesn't have neck pain. And so what can happen is when that Ren line tightens, so if you watch my sight line here, right? And I'm looking at the camera and my Ren line tightens, my sight line is going to come down. And to compensate for that, I have to look up, but that's uncomfortable. So I'm going to come head forward on that, which is now going to create chi stagnation in the back of the neck. And it's going to tighten the entire like Shaoyang and the entire Taiyang axis. So when we start to gua sha and we start to break up those adhesions and we start to like oxygenate it, the first mark of health is that their head is going to come back and they should be able to pitch all the way back. So gua sha, in terms of Hashimoto's, is an absolute unsung hero, absolute unsung hero. And so I just go to Pearl River and I get those like little like gua sha spoons, $1.50, and I hand them out like candy, right? Spoon for you, spoon for you, spoon for you. And I teach patients how to gua sha the back of their necks, and I teach them how to safely gua sha the thyroid. And it's one of the best gems, and it's one of the best takeaways I hope you have from this lecture, is just gua sha the neck. Gua sha the high holy hell out of the neck. Next thing that you can do is nutrition. So I know gluten, I know it's a thing, right? I know like everyone makes fun of like gluten, but with Hashimoto's, this is my only non-negotiable in the treatment room. If a patient is not willing to go gluten-free, I just tell them, you're welcome to come in for wellness, but like I can't move the needle forward on this. Reason being, the protein in gluten is very similar to proteins that we see within the thyroid itself. So in a hyperactive immune state, what happens is when we eat gluten, and let's say gluten reads just like chemical signatures ABC123, and the thyroid proteins are ABCXYZ. So the immune system sees ABC and is like, I know this, I know exactly what this is. And it will go in and it will attack the site at where that protein is. So what happens is when you have Hashimoto's and you eat gluten, you're keeping the immune system in a heightened state and you're not allowing it to calm down. You're not allowing those antibodies to come down. So the number one thing a patient can do for themselves with Hashi is to start to correct this and get those antibodies down is to go gluten-free. And then of course you can always like get them, you know, add thyroid supporting foods, because remember selenium and tyrosine, like these were those building blocks. And like for the sake of just time, I'm going to blow through this because this is stuff you can always look online, right? And then, so there's a question, would you recommend gluten-free with simple hypothyroidism as well? If there's no presence in antibodies, no need. Gluten's delicious. It's the best thing ever. I mean, there's a reason we call it the Fertile Crescent, right? Like, it's a fabulous protein. It's amazing. Like, if you don't have to go gluten-free, don't. But certain autoimmunes, Hashimoto's, celiac, lupus, RA, MS, those are big ones where going gluten-free actually helps the patient with their symptoms, and it can clear up a lot of like the fatigue, the foggy thinking. Thyroid supporting foods, meat, shellfish, you can look all of that up on your own time. Iodine, it's a much bigger conversation. I'm happy to come back in a couple months and have an iodine conversation around this. Start with the work of Dr. Brownstein if this is something interesting. Don't really want to jump too much into that right now. Okay, and the next thing to do is stabilize the blood sugar. So, because remember that glucose is part of that alchemical transformation that happens, right? So when the blood sugar is stable, the Hashis, or really anyone, but particularly a Hashi's patient, is going to feel much better. So what I tell patients all the time, start with fat and protein in the morning. Absolutely nothing that contains sugar or converts to sugar for at least 2 hours. So if they want to have fruit, they can go have fruit. Like, fine, go eat your fruit. Fruit's great. But do it 2 hours after the fat and protein. So it's the only time that I suggest keto. So this is the only time that I suggest keto is in the morning, because it's basically a metabolic hack is what happens, right? And when the blood sugar stabilizes and the body's not having to produce insulin in response to that, like, they're not going to have these spikes throughout the day. And the first mark of health, if they stabilize the blood sugar, is that they don't need coffee or cookies in the afternoon. Okay, other thing. Patients taking synthetic T4, that's going to be our Synthroid, our levothyroxine, anything that's kind of in that family, they have to take calcium. Anyone long-term on this has to take calcium. So there were some misinformed studies that came out a couple of years ago that was linking Hashimoto's with osteoporosis. And upon a deeper dive, that's not the connection. The connection is Synthroid. So some drugs, some classes of drugs, in order to work better, they're going to be metabolizing very specific vitamins and minerals. And when they metabolize those vitamins and minerals, they're going to eat them up. So Synthroid uses calcium in order to be used properly by the body, which leads to, if you're not replacing that, like, it's going to get pulled from the bones, and it can lead to all those like osteoporosis, like fragile bones, that kind of thing. So patients taking a synthetic calcium, it's not enough to pull it from the patients taking synthetic hormone T4 have to take calcium. It's not enough to pull it from the diet. All right, I have 4 minutes, so I'm going to blow through a couple things. I'm going to give you my top 5 formulas that I use, and this is not what they teach you in school, but I'm teaching it here, okay? So my top 5 formulas, Pingwei-san, right? Warm the middle. I told you that I start with the spleen, and Pingwei-san is, it's food grade. It's really, 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 really gentle. It's really gentle. So sometimes what happens is if somebody's spleen is so incredibly compromised, and we try to go into guns blazing with a bigger spleen formula, they're just not going to digest it. It's not going to sit well. So Pingwei-san is kind of my gateway drug to starting to like turn that spleen on, starting to warm things from the center. And I've also found that if somebody's really spleen deficient, if you're able to start raw, right, they're going to be able to digest it better. Someone needs to turn their microphone off. If you start any sort of, so spleen formulas, raw or granules are the best way to go. If you start giving people spleen formulas with tablets or they're not always going to be able to digest it. Lejinsatong. So I love Lejinsatong because of the Renshen. Xiao Chai Hutong, right? Remember that I was saying like those conversion issues that happen of T4 to T3, and especially if there's insomnia. I love giving patients Xiao Chai Hutong like before bed at night. Bancha Hopotong. Okay, this is another secret weapon. I said there's no secrets, but this is another secret weapon. So Bansha Hopotong, when modified, remember it goes to the throat and it removes phlegm from the throat. So what it's going to do, Bansha Hopotong, as we can add more phlegm herbs to it, but it will literally start to decongest the throat and it'll start to deflame the thyroid. And sometimes this is like Bansha Hopotong, like regardless of whether it's Hashi's or just simple hypothyroidism, is a great carrier formula for this. I can't sing the praises enough. And notice that I put Bujang Ichitong last. So Bujang Ichitong, because it has the Huangqi in it, which is a huge immune modulator, classic Bujang Ichitong, the therapeutic index for Huangqi was at 28 grams. Now, if you have somebody who is really spleen qi deficient and they're center deficient, you're going to blow a gasket on them with this. Like Bujang Ichitong is sometimes, like especially if they've had Hashis for a long time, Bujang Ichitong is something that you have to work your way up to, right? So working your way up to this, you need to expect at least like 3-4 months minimum of doing things like the ping way, repairing the gut, making sure that liver qi is able to convert the T4 to T3. Okay, last slide, I swear. And just stay with me for 3 more minutes. I'm so sorry I'm running over time, but 3 more minutes because I'm just dying to give you this information. So the 8 ways to cheerlead patients is going to be, ask them out of the gate, what does managed Hashimoto's look like to you? This is the most important question that you can lead with, right? Because you want to follow the patient to where they want to go. So for some people, managed Hashis might mean, I just want to be able to wake up in the morning. I want to be able to play with my kids. I want to be able, like this foggy thinking. I want to be able to get through the day. That's what managed might mean to one person. Managed to me is that my Hashis, I come in and out of Hashis. I ride that line. So when I'm stressed, when I'm overworked, all those things, I come into it. When I'm on the bandwagon and doing everything I'm supposed to be doing, I come out of it. So Hashi's, this answer is going to be as individual to the patient as that patient is an individual. So always ask, what does that actually look like to you? Does that mean like, and sometimes if they're like, dude, I don't know, like, I've never even thought about that. What does managed Hashi's look like? I will often sometimes answer and I say, well, I think managed Hashi's looks like the least amount of medication possible. And if we can get your antibodies like into remission. Now, I don't believe in miracles, I rely on them. So it's something that I see can be done when you take on the game of playing this as an immune function disorder versus an endocrine function disorder. So you also need to reframe the conversation that they tell themselves that their body is betraying them. And we see this like across the board, right? With all autoimmune, it's like, oh, my body, like, ah. And there's so much like anger directed towards the body if the body's not behaving in a way that it should be. And so there's this gross sense of betrayal and this gross sense that the body has kind of failed them in some way, right? It's simply not true. It's actually the opposite. Like in certain cases of autoimmune, your body actually loves you more than you love your body. Your body is trying to protect you. Your body is hypervigilant. Your body is doing everything it can to provide you with this amazing human experience. And it just kind of got something wrong. Like it went in for the wrong fight. Like that's all. So sometimes the reframing of that conversation, I've seen that be mind-blowing for patients where they're just like, my body loves me. My body loves me. And it sets kind of like resets this chi dynamic they have with form, and it actually makes healing a little bit easier. Okay, teach them to gua sha their neck and throat, get them on the moxa bandwagon. Don't worry about overselling it. Do everything you can, even if you're, just like here, like baby food lid jars, just gua sha, gua sha, gua sha. Um, find thyroid literate MDs willing to regularly test the antibodies. So I ask all the time, do you like your doctor? And if they say like, meh, I say, time to find a new one. So I keep a list of MDs who are regularly willing to test antibodies. And that's one of the things, like in New York, right? Scope of practice is we're not allowed to do blood tests. If we were allowed to do blood tests in New York, I would have a totally different practice model. My practice would look absolutely, completely different. But the fact I'm not allowed to do these blood tests means that I've had to form relationships and go find MDs willing to do this and MDs willing to have the conversation. And that's not necessarily like a bad thing. Like, it leads to a pretty good network. Don't demonize medication. Just don't. Don't be one of those like jerky acupuncturists who are like, oh, meds. Medication saves lives, point blank. And desiccated thyroid, like I said, it actually falls within the realm and scope of Chinese herbs because it's an animal product. And there are some people that they need to take their Lejinsatong or their Shaoyaosan or whatever to function. And there are some people that need to take Nature-Throid to function. So don't demonize it and don't scare patients off of it, because sometimes they need that little bit of medication in order to cut through the fatigue and everything to actually take this on as a bigger project to take healing on. And regularly before Googleectomies, when patients come in and they're just like, I saw this on this blog, like, no, get them off the Google. Just get them off the Google. And so that means that this is something, anything that you're interested in terms of like where you want to be spending your time, make sure that you have patient resources. And if the resources don't exist, create them. Give them something so that they can actually like walk away with like in their hand and say like, this is the information that I want you to have. And so, for example, on my website, I have like a reading room where I list like all the books that I want them looking at. And I tell patients, go look at the reading room before you run like a Google search on this, because you're going to drive me crazy. Like, I'm going to have to like start to basically like deprogram like what you're pulling off the internet. Okay, get them excited about blood work and encourage them to track the results over time in a spreadsheet. I have a spreadsheet that has 10 years worth of thyroid testing, and I get my thyroid tested every 4 to 6 months. So I can start to, it's just basically objective information where I can start to understand my body a little bit bigger and like what I need. But that spreadsheet, absolutely over time, you can start to see trends, and I can see trends like, you know, if I get my thyroid tested like towards my period, like that's going to shift, right? And then lastly, have a long-term treatment plan contracted with the patient. So don't let the patient leave and just be like, all right, dude, see you. When do you want to come in? Like, I don't know, just book online. Don't do that. So I always tell patients, I say, look, like in this long-term healing plan, first thing that we're going to do is I got to correct your spleen. So I need you eating warm foods. I need you off gluten. I need you off pingwei-san, right? And then with these 3 things, the mark of health that we're going to get, right, is that like, I want like less fatigue, blah, 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 right? Okay. And then once they hit those marks of health, have them watch for the marks of health and then tell them you're going to graduate them to the next formula. And they get so excited. And it's just like, okay, when you graduate to the next formula, that's going to take 6 to 8 weeks. I don't know, maybe a little bit more. We're going to watch for that. When you graduate to the next formula, I'm going to put you on, I don't know, Bancha Hopo Tong modified and Shao Chai Hu Tong at night, right? And then we're going to push you out to once every 2 weeks, and we're just going to sit back and see how you do. Don't let them walk out without this treatment plan, and then tell them what the markers of health that they're looking for in that period and say like, I want you to retest. And hopefully at that time, the antibodies are coming down. And if they're trending down, then we're going to graduate you to the next piece. So the patient has an idea of like what to expect, what to watch for, what you're hoping for, like in terms of guiding them, and then what they need to look for in the blood work. And then hopefully within that like 6 months, they're empowered enough that they're able to really like take this on their own, and that they're just kind of, you're there to support them. That's our best job. So again, I brought you 8 minutes over. I'm so sorry, but thank you all for the first like lecture series. The one thing that I know Cynthia wanted me to mention is that I will be doing a talk with Clayton Shu on COVID long haulers. When is that, Kelly?
Cynthia can chime in. I've forgotten myself. Cynthia?
That is May. It's a weekday evening in May.
Yep. So Clayton and I have been working on that since like I've been kind of here at ground zero in terms of like COVID. I've been working with patients since actually January 2020, before we knew it was COVID. So if you guys are interested, just kind of watch for that, because Clayton is an inspiration. And thank you guys so much. And thank you, Kelly and Cynthia, for giving me the bandwidth to do this. It's giving me the platform to share this. So thank you guys.
Yeah, no, thank you, Heidi. That was amazing. And this makes me look forward to continuing this lecture series, the Clinic New York lecture series. There were some questions. Maybe we'll shoot them to you. And if, you know, at a later date, we can get to some of those questions as we're bringing this to a close. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
All right, thanks, guys.
All righty. Right. Yes, the recording will be shared. I see someone asking in the chat. The recording will be shared and it'll be stored somewhere on the Student Hub. We'll make sure everyone knows where it's being shared, okay? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end for everyone since it seems like there's no more questions. And once again, I'll see you guys at a later date at the next clinic series for New York in May. Bye.